Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Findmypast Live. My name is Ellie. I run social media for Findmypast, and thank you so much for joining us today. I've got a very special guest with me. But before we begin, if you're new here, we host these sessions twice a week. We host them here on Facebook, and it's a chance for you to interact with each other, ask questions, and hopefully learn something new as well. We do an expert session every week on a Wednesday, and then we do a more relaxed one on a Friday. So I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Kate Strasden. She is a senior lecturer in cultural studies at Falmouth University, and she specialises in 19th and early to mid 20th century women's wear. And she also lectures for the Art Society. And if you're on Instagram, definitely check out her Instagram account. She has over 130,000 followers on there. So welcome, Kate. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Ellie. It's so lovely to be here. It's I know we're all in strange times, but it's at least we're able to do this kind of event. So thanks for having me.
No, absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you. Now, I'm just going to make sure I've got the comments open so I can see people coming in. Let me just open that up now. Let's have a look. Okay, yeah, we've got our first viewers. We've got Melody, we've got Kim, Georgia, Sue, Pat, Rosie, Jacqueline, Victoria, Deborah, and everybody's saying hi to you as well, Kate.
Ah.
Fantastic. Now, obviously, I've introduced you, but I just wondered if you wouldn't mind telling our viewers at home a little bit more about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, sure. I think somebody used the term portfolio career a couple of years ago, which I'd never heard of before, but actually it makes sense because what I do, I realized when I was quite young that I really loved old clothes, and that was I couldn't see how to make a career out of it. But as I got older, and I did a master's degree in the history of textiles and dress, and then when my kids were very small, I did my PhD, and I didn't really know what direction it might take me. But I started to do a little bit of teaching at Falmouth University, and then it just evolved into a permanent position there, but 2 days a week or 2.5 days a week. And then I do, you mentioned the lecturing for the Art Society and other freelance things, and then I write as well. So it's kind of like a patchwork career where different things slot into different places, and it fits pretty well with family, and yeah, it's been an interesting journey.
Good. Well, I mean, it's evident from your CV, your biography, so to speak, that you have a real passion for clothes and fashion. Where did that actually even stem from?
Do you know, I don't know. I collected, and I've got them here. I don't know if anybody else can remember, but back in the late 70s, early 80s, these books came out, or they were tea cards that were sold with the Brooke Bond tea packages. And they came out in different series, so you could do British wildlife or, you know, trees and things like that. And then that was the series of British costume, and the cards would come out, and I just was completely fascinated by them. So they had these brilliant, each card came in the tea, and you would stick them into this little book. And I started collecting these when I was about 8 or 9, I think. For me, it was just about people. So I was always interested in history, and it's about the history of the people that have come before us, and the closest you get to that is their clothes. That's their outline, you know, that's the shape of people. And I just found this idea that there were surviving garments that people had worn that we might know nothing about, but they're still with us, and that completely gripped me, really.
That is a fascinating thought, that you could come across a piece of historical clothing and you know nothing about the person or the people that actually wore it. That is actually quite powerful. But before we get into our discussion today, for everybody at home, what we're going to be chatting about, Kate and I, we're going to be talking about the concept of fashion for our average, everyday ancestors. A little bit about the trends that have changed fashion for our ancestors and in history, the best sources that you can use for fashion history. And then what we'll do is we'll do a short Q&A at the end. So if you do have a question for Kate, please pop it into the comments, and we'll try and get to as many as we can before we wrap up. Let me just go back to the comments and welcome everybody else that we've got coming in as well before we get started. We've got Daphne, Fenella, Karen, Tess, Fatima, Jackie, Marie, Sean, Ivy, Mary. We've got Lena, Moira, Rita, Fenella. Oh, I already said hi to Fenella. My apologies. Lovely, fantastic. Thank you everybody for joining. What we will do is we will crack on now. Kate, you've written a couple of books about your profession and your love of fashion. I just wondered whether you could tell us a little bit more about those.
Yeah, so the first book I wrote was actually, it was based on my doctoral research, which was looking at the wardrobe of Queen Alexandra. Queen Alexandra was Queen Victoria's daughter-in-law. She married Edward, Prince of Wales, in 1863, and I had come across her when I was working as a curator, assistant to a curator in a costume collection here in Devon, where I live. And we'd been given some garments that had come from a dressmaker called Redfern. And I did some research into this name of John Redfern and discovered that he was one of the dressmakers to Queen Alexandra. And when I started to look at pictures for her, and she was completely fascinating because there were all of these amazing photographs of her in these tailor-made costumes, but when I looked, nobody had actually written anything very much about the way she dressed, even though she was a real 19th century fashion icon. So I started to research how many of her garments still survived, and there were loads. And I've discovered, well, now in excess of 140 garments, but they're all over the world. So they are as far scattered as Sydney, Los Angeles, Toronto, Tokyo. They are all over the world. And my doctorate became the kind of virtual reassembly of her wardrobe, and then talking about what you can learn about somebody from the clothes that they leave behind. And this is where I think it's interesting when you think about it in terms of ancestry and family history, is that we all kind of convey things about ourselves through dress. Even if we're not particularly interested in fashion, it's still part of our identity. And with Alexandra, it was very much about, okay, so what can we say about this really, privileged, very wealthy woman in the 19th century, but what can we learn about her through the clothes that she left behind? And it became this really exciting sort of navigation through her life.
Yeah, it sounds brilliant. And just what you said there about, you may not necessarily be very interested in fashion or clothes, but what you wear says a little something about you. That actually reminds me of a quote from The Devil Wears Prada. I think it's something Meryl Streep says in that. I don't know if anybody at home thinks the same. And let's move on to sort of fashion and family history then. I think that takes us nicely into that. So I think a lot of us have this idea of, we see these beautiful pictures of people in these gorgeous clothing, say Victorian dress or Edwardian. And I think we've got this idea that fashion like that was restricted to the wealthy, or to the people who could afford it. And I suppose that leads me into my actual question, which is, what did fashion mean for our everyday working ancestors? Like, were they able to keep up with the latest fashions, for example?
I think high fashion obviously is one thing, and you've got, certainly from the mid 19th century onwards, you've got the notion of couture, which starts to emerge in Paris, and houses like Charles Frederick Worth and Paquin and these what came to be very well known fashion houses emerged. But I think as then as now, people are interested in clothes. Now, it doesn't mean that you can afford to buy you might not necessarily be able to afford to go to Regent Street and buy the most expensive version of something, but I think regardless of social strata, people have ways of making their clothing fashionable for them. And it might be that they see a picture in one of the fashion periodicals that was starting to emerge in the 19th century. Vogue started in the 1890s, but there are lots of other more affordable fashion magazines. There were things like Sylvia's Home Journal, which was a sort of more middling to lower middle class journal that gave tips on fashion. So there were lots of ways that people in the middle classes and and the working classes as well, would look at making their wardrobes, adding something to their wardrobe that they enjoyed. Now, it might be that they only had, you know, if you're lower down the social scale, it might be that you just have one garment that's your best, but that doesn't mean that you're not enjoying clothes, or that you don't have access to some kind of interest in fashion, even if it's not high fashion.
Of course. And the way I sort of think about it, I'd correct me if I'm wrong, Kate, but is it a little bit like today when you've got catwalks of what's coming up in the next season, and then over the next couple of months to a year, those trends will filter down into our everyday shops? Is it a little bit like that?
It is, although interestingly, you know, that's the kind of trickle down theory where you've got high culture that sort of works its way down. But I think interestingly, what you see particularly in the late 19th and early 20th century is also evidence of sort of trickle up theory as well, which is, for example, you see somebody like Edward, Prince of Wales, or who was briefly to become Edward VIII. He starts to wear things like Fair Isle jumpers and flat caps and tweed jackets that were very much a marker of the working and kind of folk trends. So things like Fair Isle jumpers were very much part of a completely different social space, and he makes them fashionable. He brings them into another kind of context, and so you do see evidence of that, some things working their way into different social spaces as well.
That's it. I've never really thought of it that way, that it could move both ways. So a fashion or a trend could pass from, say, high society down to the working class, but it also could work the other way. I've never really thought about it like that. And I suppose it leads me on to my next question: is what did clothes and what did fashion mean for our everyday ancestors? You know, people who worked in, for example, the factories or on the farms. What did it mean for them?
It's much more colourful. So I think one of the notions is that we're so used to seeing photographs in the 19th century and early 20th century, even into the 1950s, that are black and white. And I think it naturally makes us imagine those periods in shades of grey scale, you know. But actually, when you look at garments that survive in museums, the colours are phenomenal. Colours, patterns, prints, textures, even as you get more synthetic fibres as well, in the sort of 20s, 30s and onwards, it means that you can have things that look like silk, but they're actually art silk, artificial silk or rayon. And so colour and variety is much more present in wardrobes than I think often the kind of popular perceptions are. But I think it's the idea of being able to make things as well, you know, from the 1850s onwards, when sewing machines became more widely available, and you get things like the English Woman's Domestic magazine that starts to sell patterns in their magazines. So access to home dressmaking becomes really important from that point on. And so you can see the things that are happening in some of the high fashion magazines, and then you can do your version of it with your Singer sewing machine, and you can adapt things to make them your version of your fashionable self.
Yeah, I remember seeing patterns in magazines when I was growing up. I always fancied myself somebody who'd be able to make them, but I've just never quite developed that skill for dressmaking, which is a shame. I'll tell you what, before we move on, Kate, let's have another look at the comments and we'll see what people are saying. Let me just scroll back up. Yeah, we have Niall in the comments as well, everybody at home, so interact with him as well. Say hi to him. Deborah saying, I have that British costume book among many others. Fenella saying, Brooke Bond, PG tips. What else have we got here? Ellen saying it's a steamy day in Illinois.
Wow.
Oh, it's not very nice here in Scotland. I'll tell you what, well, should we take a question or two, Kate?
Yeah, of course.
So Victoria's asking, when did people start to use rubber soles as opposed to leather soles in their shoes?
Rubber soles happen sort of from the 1920s. You do start to get, in the 1910s, you start to get rubber making an entry into wardrobes. So for things like dress shields, which before effective antiperspirants, women would have rubber dress shields that they would sew into the underarm of their bodices to protect their garments from perspiration stains. And they're pretty revolting. If you come across one in a box, yeah, they're kind of quite nasty things. But
I didn't even know that was a thing.
the thing. So by the 20s and 30s, you start to get rubber-soled shoes as that sort of leisure wear industry really takes off. And so the idea of plimsolls and those kinds of those pieces of footwear. And interestingly, one of the reasons that flappers is supposed to be a name, when you get that notion of the flapper in the 1920s, was because of the rubber galoshes that which were these kind of flappy pieces of footwear that girls were wearing in the 20s. So apparently that's where the term flappers comes from, was because of the galoshes that were flapping around that they were wearing at that point.
I didn't know that either. You learn something new every day. We've got Andrew saying hi, Elaine saying a little late, so sorry. Don't worry, Elaine. And remember, if you did miss the beginning, you can always catch up on Facebook. Just go to our video section, and this will also be uploaded to YouTube as well. So don't forget that. We've got Graham saying hi from Australia, Lisa from Arizona, got Wendy. Lisa saying American fashion magazines called Alexandra her royal sweetness. Have you come across that?
No, I didn't know that. How brilliant. I mean, she was hugely popular. She was the first royal to be called, she was called the People's Princess here because she had this, she was Danish originally. And so I think she had this very natural approach to the way that she interacted with people, and it made her a very popular, especially compared to to Queen Victoria and Edward. She was seen as a much more accessible kind of royal. So that's really interesting, thanks.
And she was also, correct me if I'm wrong, the longest serving Princess of Wales.
Yes, I think she was nearly 40 years. So I mean, it was pretty much the whole of her adult, or the majority of her adult life. Yeah.
We've also got Jen from Colorado. We've got Sonia from Johannesburg. We've got Andrew, and he's saying, I've got a cracking photo of my 4 times great aunt Sarah from around 1875 wearing a fur, yet she was by no means middle class and definitely not upper class. So she was wearing fur in the
Wow.
1870s.
So yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. So things that we associate as being markers of status, things like fur, which certainly, in the 1980s and things like that, but there were different grades of it. So it could be that would be something like rabbit fur, or it would have come from animals that were, I know furs are tricky objects now, but in the context of that time and place, they were very much about aspirational. If you could have something that was demonstrating that you knew how to think about looking fashionable, then that was a really important thing.
Yeah, maybe that's what your 4 times great aunt Sarah was doing, Andrew, just maybe trying to, maybe making herself feel a little bit better, maybe dressing a little bit nicer, but also displaying to other people that she was maybe a little bit wealthier than she was. That's interesting. I've got another question from Daphne here, before we move on with my questions. Where did the idea that men wear trousers and women wear dresses actually come from? That's a good question.
It's a really good question. I mean, the origins, skirts remain one of the most gendered objects, really. I mean, certainly in Western cultures. Still, I think it's unusual outside of something like a Scottish kilt. It's unusual for men to choose to wear a skirt. I think a lot of men would really find that difficult, and yet now, of course, women are very happy to wear trousers. And so it's a very interesting concept, and women wore skirts right the way through from the medieval period up until really the 1940s. And in fact, my granny absolutely would never wear trousers all of her life, even into her 50s, 60s. She was born in 1922, and for her it was just a step too far. So there was no way she was ever going to, although women were starting to at that point. In the 1930s, it was really only for kind of beach pajamas and those kinds of leisured spaces. And it wasn't really until the 1950s, 1960s and into the 70s that it becomes part of the workplace, certainly the 70s as seen as a kind of office wear. So why that is interesting. I know there have been lots of theories over the years about it being a sign of male, kind of control over the female body. I think that's a bit old hat, actually. And I think dress has been an area that has been under the control of women, and it's been an area that when in other parts of their life they had very little control in terms of their financial lives, their marital status, all of that kind of thing. Actually, dress was an area of their life that they could control. And so I think we tend to write skirts off too easily. I did research into women mountaineers as part of my MA years ago, and they did amazing things in skirts. They were climbing all sorts of very difficult peaks. And so I think skirts are a bit of a much maligned object, actually.
That's brilliant. That leads me really nicely into my next question. And my next question is, do you think that there are certain trends in fashion that changed history forever, or for our everyday ancestors, or at least if they didn't change history forever, they might have changed it for that period? Are there any standout pieces or trends that you can think of?
I think probably for certainly in the most recent generations past, for women, the point, for example, where they didn't customarily wear corsets was a big shift. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean, this is another, I think, I quite like the idea of myth busting when it comes to fashion, because I think there is a notion that in the 19th century and earlier, but certainly in the 19th century, that all women were tight lacing their corsets and they were fainting all over the place and, damaging their internal organs. And it's a sort of popular myth. And you see it, I think, films like Gone with the Wind, where you had Scarlett O'Hara being winched into her corsets, that helped to reinforce that notion. When you look at garments that survive in museums, they're actually much more of a normal size. So some women tight-laced, some women did, particularly for going out in the evening, I guess a bit like, women might wear Spanx or something now. You would tight lace in the evenings, but for every day, it wasn't as restrictive as we might imagine it to be. And everybody wore corsets. So whether you were high status, whether you were working class, everybody wore corsets. So I guess that point post Great War, post World War I, where women started to wear different clothes that didn't require them to wear corsets, that's a big shift. I think for men, there have been, in the 18th century, you have this amazing, colourful palette for menswear. And then after the Regency period, so from the 1820s onwards, when the idea of what men do is much more about proving your respectability, men's wardrobes become much quieter. And that's something that's persisted really for a very, very long time. And I guess it's really only in the late 20th, early 21st century that men have started to feel that they can explore different ways of dressing again. But for a long time, I think that shift towards men have to appear in sober coloured clothes was a long held notion, really.
Actually, I was on the phone to my grandmother yesterday evening, and she was telling me about the fact that she likes to watch Michael Portello's programs on the railways, and he dresses you know, what we would say is quite flamboyantly, but I actually love his fashion style. I actually walked past him in Dundee once and he was wearing these bright red trousers and I just thought they looked wonderful. And I'm so pleased that hopefully most men can now feel that they can dress how they want to, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. There isn't that same kind of expectation of that flamboyance means that you know, it was a moral judgment for a really long time, that if you're a man, you're wearing colourful clothes, that means you're not serious, you're not sensible. It questions all sorts of things about your morality, which we're long past now. So but I think for a long time that shift towards those colours was had an impact on the male wardrobe.
I had a question about a particular garment actually. A couple of years ago, I was an extra on Outlander, and I was given all of these different things, these different parts of my costume to wear while we were filming. And one of them, and I can't remember the name of it. You'll know. It was something that sat on your hips to make underneath your skirt to make your hips look wider. What was that called?
Possibly a bum roll.
That was it. Yeah. When did that sort of ease out then?
Well, it's been really, underpinnings are really interesting, because I think it's only really from the 1960s that underpinnings have stopped being important in order to shape the way our silhouettes look. And so I think that's always really been a very interesting aspect of fashion, which is that your clothes are very much determined by what's going on underneath. And so the bum roll in different shapes, it was there throughout the 18th century and earlier, but it changes its position. So, you know, you've got the panniers that sit outside the very formal ones, which are sort of built on a cage of cane and linen. The bum roll creates a slightly smaller lift to the skirt. But of course, in the 19th century, you have the crinoline, which was the cage crinoline, very lightweight, very maneuverable. That created the big dome-shaped skirts of the 1860s. And then in the 1870s and 80s, you go back to the padded version that goes around the waist to create the bustle that sticks out at the back. So really all the way through, there have been these variations on a theme in exaggerating different parts of the body for different reasons. And men had them as well. In the 18th century, men had calf pads, which is, I think, my favourite kind of
pads.
You know, the idea that it's only women that are vain about bodies. So, you know, a point when men are wearing knee breeches and it's fashionable to have a very well turned calf. If you happen to have a very skinny calf, men would have calf pads which were made out of lamb's wool that they would stuff down the back of their stockings to give them a nice muscled calf.
I didn't know that either.
Right, I love that.
That's wonderful.
I know.
Absolutely wonderful. Right, let's have another quick look at the comments. Victoria says, my Italian grandmother used to add lace collars to tops and brocade and ribbon and sequins or fur to other outfits to elevate and individualize them.
And that's really important. I think customization, that's another way that maybe we're talking about now, you know, in as we're becoming more aware that fast fashion is maybe not the way forward for us, that customization and individualization of clothes, buying something secondhand, changing it, adding something, that actually that's a much more sustainable way of approaching dress, I think.
Absolutely. And another quick question from Fenella. She says, when did people start to buy their clothes from shops rather than go to a tailor or a dressmaker?
It's very much partly dependent on wealth. So dressmakers remain very important really up until the 1850s, 1860s, where most people, you would buy your cloth from a draper and then you would take your cloth to tailor or dressmaker. And there were thousands of them. I mean, in the UK, each town would have a number of tailors and dressmakers to cater to the local population. And so what you have from the 1850s onwards is the idea of department stores who can provide semi-ready-made garments. So you could go and try something on and then it could be fitted to you, but it's partially ready, you know, it's been partially made up. So it's partly to do with mass production. As factories start to produce things more quickly, as you have sewing machines that can produce things more quickly. So people are going to shops and buying either semi-ready-made or ready-made, ready-to-wear garments. So that's really what determined the experience of shopping. And also just things like from the early 1900s, places like Selfridges having loos in shops, you know, that starts to determine how often and for how long people can go shopping for, because they can access public conveniences. So that started to impact how shopping spaces were used as well.
I find that history of department stores quite fascinating. I remember when Mr. Selfridge was on ITV a few years ago, I lapped that up. I thought that was wonderful. And just how you start off and you've got the main character and she has to take gloves out to show somebody, and then she moves to work at Selfridges and they can just browse.
No, that world is really interesting. And when you look at the history of something like Selfridges, you know, they have writing rooms and they have lounges, and that whole experience was one of, you know, come and buy things from us and you can sit in the lounge and write letters.
I think that's just lovely. Another quick look at the comments before we move on. Jennifer is saying hello from Texas. Terry is saying hello from Seattle. Lynn is saying hello from Scotland. We've got a very international audience today.
That's amazing. That's great. That's what I love about this.
We've got a comment here from Jen. She says, I've never thought about the impact of seeing black and white photos and the impression it leaves on us. Thinking of their world in shades of grey. Very interesting perspective.
No, it's true. And I think it's only when I started to work in museum stores and really appreciated the whole range of colour, you know, it was a technicolor world, you know, their clothing was bright. But I think sometimes even when you see that some clothes are darker than others in photographs, you still kind of have this perception that they're all quite dull. And of course, no one's smiling in the photographs because exposure times were too long. And so I think that also creates this very particular perception that we have.
I mean, going back to the discussion we had about fur before, do you think there were certain materials or dyes that maybe were not readily available to our sort of everyday relatives?
Yes, I mean, in the 1850s, you get the emergence of aniline dyes, which were discovered by accident. So purple had always been a really notoriously difficult colour to fix on cloth. It would either fade or it wouldn't. It wasn't predictable. And then in the 1850s, a chemist called William Perkins, by accident, he was actually working with coal, but as a byproduct of some of his experiments, he had a residue that he ended up calling movine, and it fixed the colour purple, this bright shade of purple, to cloth. And it became an absolute craze in the 1850s. Punch wrote cartoons about the purple measles that was spreading across the UK because everybody was suddenly buying this purple dress. So technology, that kind of technology sometimes can really have an impact on fashion, of course. But it wasn't readily available to everybody initially because it was a new thing and it was fashionable, and therefore it was more expensive.
Absolutely. And going back to my university days, I did a module on the Byzantine Empire, and it was purple then was seen as a very high status colour. There were emperors who were said to have been born in the purple. Maybe that comes back to the fact that, as you said, it was just so difficult to hold on to. It didn't.
I think that's why. Yeah, exactly. It was such the scarcity of it as a colour and its difficulty meant that it was, you know, at various times throughout history had been restricted to particular social classes. And so interestingly, purple has that kind of association, I think.
Got a question from Jen here. She says, what was the impact of fashion history globally? Would my US ancestors have been impacted by the UK? And would the UK have been impacted by Australia?
I think definitely it's things that have determined that have been war, for example. So in the 20th century, you had Paris that from the 18th century onwards had been incredibly influential, and you still had people sending across from the US to Paris for their clothes if you could afford it. And so Paris was where everybody looked. And then during the Second World War, particularly when the couture industry had to completely cease production, that's when you start to see the American sportswear industry thrive, and you have these amazing designers like Claire McCardell, Bonnie Cashin, Anne Fogarty, brilliant lot of female designers who were coming up with a completely different aspiration, which is affordable, wearable, stylish, good design. And this was where the American fashion industry was trying to gather its own momentum and not look towards Paris for its sort of style inspiration. So I think influences come in different shapes and forms. So I think, for example, in the 80s, you had figures like Diana, Diana, Princess of Wales, who was certainly having an impact on fashion globally, certainly in Western cultures, again, that having that impact. So sometimes it can be about particular figures who inspire and set trends, and they can cross cross the Atlantic and inspire in different ways. And I guess within an Australian context, when you've got, I think the royal family has, at different times ebbed and flowed in terms of popularity, but those kinds of influences can play a part.
Of course. Brilliant, thank you. We'll just move on to, I've got another couple of questions, and then we will try and get to as many of your questions at home as possible. So we'll try and get through these as quickly as I can. So my next question for you, Kate, is our audience at home, myself, we're quite interested in, in family history and our ancestors, and we're all about the sources. So because we want to learn more about the context of our ancestors' lives, what sources can we use to find out about their clothes and what they wore and their fashion choices, things like that? Are there any sources that we should look to in the first instance?
There are loads of great and very affordable books. So books, just general books. So for example, the V&A did a whole series on fashion in detail. There's the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, and they are great examples of how to look at objects and identify what time period they came from, some of those stylistic things that really root them in their time and place. But also museum websites are so amazing now. The V&A database, the image database, contains just a wealth of detail. So if you search for particular decades, for example, you can find out about designers, but you can also find out about techniques. The same with the Met Museum in New York. They have a phenomenal,
I love the Met.
Oh, I know. And their image database is absolutely incredible. So again, you can search by date, you can search by designer, by technique, and that's another really good way of going down. There's so many historic dress collections that are all online that you can access really easily, but then all sorts of different archives. Archives that have good photographic records, so that you can, if you're interested in photographs. I think one of the top tips for me, if you're trying to date photographs, particularly if you're looking at your own family history, is that not everybody is right at the cutting edge of fashion. So sometimes if you're looking at family records, you might find that something that looks like it's an 1890s sleeve, for example, they might be just a little bit later, because very often middle class, working class families are not necessarily being able to afford to stay on top of what's happening in Vogue or in London, whatever. They're still fashionable, but there might be a slight kind of satellite delay in when they're starting to wear things.
That makes sense, absolutely. Right, what else have I got here? The other thing I wanted to say as well was, you've mentioned all these fantastic resources at museums and on museum websites. I must admit, if I'm ever in London and I'm at the V&A, one of the first places I go is at the fashion exhibits, because they're just spectacular.
Yeah.
And the last time my mum was here in Scotland, we went to the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, and there was the fashion exhibit there, and she just spent a good 40 minutes to an hour looking around all these incredible garments. And hopefully when all these museums open up again, we can go and visit the clothes again.
Know. And I think it's interesting, fashion exhibitions have outsold every other kind of museum exhibit for the last, I think, starting with the Alexander McQueen Savage Beauty exhibition at the Met, well, when was that, 2011, 2012? They have outsold every other show, because I think, again, it's about people are fascinated, not necessarily by high fashion, but by clothes, because it's about people. And that's what makes it so compelling, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you. Okay, let's go do another couple of questions from you guys at home. So Victoria says, very interesting, thank you. An ancestor of mine was a rackets professional early 1900s. So what would he have worn if rubber-soled shoes were not around at that point? This goes back to the shoes question.
Yes, yeah. Rubber, it might have been an early form of rubber. So there was, it was starting to emerge at the beginning of the 20th century. But for shoes, it's still, people wore leather shoes. And certainly I would, for the mountaineering, leather-soled boots that were then hobnailed were customarily worn right the way through until vulcanized rubber started to take over, and that was the kind of technology of choice. But I think you can't necessarily underestimate how flexible then those kinds of that leather-soled shoes could be when they've been worn in and you've been wearing them for a while.
Brilliant. Another couple of questions. We've got Diane. Hi, great webinar. I wondered if I could ask a question. Of course you can, Diane. That's what we're here for. An ancestor started a chain of off-the-peg gentswear in London called the Mccombie Brothers. I apologise if I've mispronounced that. Apparently it was the forerunner to Burton's ready wear for men. I can't find much about it. Where would I go to find out more?
Ooh, that sounds great.
It does.
A really great London archive for business records is the London Metropolitan Archive. So I know things are difficult to access at the moment, but I think it might be worth dropping them a line to see if they have anything. Also, you have the V&A curators at the V&A would be worth contacting, because they are a wealth of information, and also they have the Art and Design Archive there, which might have, you never know, they might have patents, they might have there's also a great advertising, it's called the National Advertising Archive, and if they are a chain that's presumably advertising in periodicals, whether it's gentlemen's magazines, things like that, then very likely something like the Advertising Archive would feature some of their material and some of the things that they were producing. So that's great. What an interesting collection that must be.
I know. Let us know how you get on with that, Diane. The other place you could try, especially for advertisements for the company, would be our newspaper collection. See if you can find any in there. That might give you some clues too. Next question. I don't think this is a question. I think it's more just of Georgia wants to share something. So she says, I have a whole family of ancestors that worked as fur sewers in Islington, London area of London in the 1890s and 1900s. Several of their neighbours also in the same trade, according to the 1891 census.
Wow. I mean, it was a massive industry. Obviously, it's problematic now, but it was a huge industry. Queen Alexandra, for example, one of her favourites was Poland and Son, and she got all of her furs from there. So it was very much a part of the way people dressed.
Another couple of things to run through here. Amanda saying, my auntie was born in 1919 and had no problem wearing trousers. Maybe it was just personal preference.
Oh, fantastic. No, and I think there was a difference. In the US, they were adopted much sooner. So it was certainly in the 1890s for sportswear, women were wearing breeches and those kinds of things in America. So I think it was taken up in America much quicker than it was in the UK.
And Sue saying, my mother born in 1926 also loved wearing trousers. Kathy asking, is there a good book you can recommend to help date fashion in photographs?
There's an interesting book by Alison Gernsheim, which is called A Victorian and Edwardian Photographic Survey. And that's very much about everyday fashion from photographs and how it places them. The National Portrait Gallery did a great series of books. I think they're still available, but they were produced in the 1990s that was about fashion in photographs. And there's an author called Avril Lancel who has done a series of books as well. They're Shire publications, so they're quite affordable. So she's done things like everyday wedding fashion, everyday fashion, seaside fashion, and they are all about using photographs to place people as well in clothes.
Great. Kathy, just to let you know as well, we had a session with another fashion historian called Kirsty a few weeks ago, and her session was very much on how to use fashion and photographs to date the photographs. So you can catch up on that on YouTube, or you can look on our Facebook page and you can have a watch back of that if you'd like to. I've got quite a lot of comments to work through, so I think I'm just going to carry on doing that, Kate, if that's all right. And then I've got one more question to ask you before we wrap up. But if we go over an hour, we go over an hour, it's fine. Gary saying, hi from Spain. What type of clothes did the working class wear in the early 1900s? And did any try to wear better clothes to be treated by the upper classes?
So from the early 1900s, you start to get things like catalogues, things like the Kay's catalogue. And so the idea that you could buy clothes on tick, you could buy them and then pay for them in monthly instalments, order them by mail order, that starts to become a thing for people on more of a stretched budget. So they'd still be very much in fashionable styles, but the materials would be cheaper materials and cheaper trimmings, things like that. But yeah, I think there is a certain degree of aspiration. I mean, clothes is all about, often is about aspirations and showing that you understand how it works. And so definitely, I think for special occasions, for Sunday best, that term of having Sunday best, which lasted a really long time, the notion that you keep your best clothes for one day a week where you go to church. And definitely clothing can be a marker of status. So when people make money in the 19th century, where there starts to become that idea of the nouveau riche and, people making money from trade, they shop at the top fashion houses because they want to show that they belong. So it's clothes has always been about class and about understanding that you can make it work for you as well.
Brilliant. I've got a question from my mother. She's very interested in fashion and fashion history. So she asks, when did standard sizing begin?
Well, there was an amazing, in America in the 1940s, there was a program by I think it was called the Works Administration team, or so it was an actual government unit that started to undertake a standardized sizing program, and they measured tens of thousands of women in the US, and they did about 12 to 16 different measurements around the body, and the sum of all of that program and all of those measurements was that they created a standardized sizing method so that you could then produce and say, right, every woman that has these measurements wears this size of clothes. Now, obviously, that has changed a lot over the years, and also by company. And we know now that things like vanity sizing, you can go into one shop and a size 14 is very different to another shop. So, but that's where it started, sort of mid-century, really.
Yeah, I think that's a very insightful question, Mum.
It is. Well done, Mum. That was a great.
Yeah, well done, Ellie's mum. I didn't know that either. So yeah. Right, I'm going to flick through the comments and just trying to pick out the question because I am conscious of time. Tess asking, can we see a screenshot of you in Outlander? Tess, I will dig it out and I will post it on the Findmypast forum for you later.
And did you get to meet Sam Hewen? That's the question.
No, he wasn't on set that day.
Oh.
I had Catriona Balfe, obviously she plays Claire Fraser. She was on set, and a couple of other main characters as well, but not Sam, unfortunately.
Okay.
Okay, Deborah saying, these days we're used to fast fashion, as we've already discussed, and keeping up with ever-changing trends. But how quickly did fashion trends actually change in the past?
The 19th century is super fast. I mean, when you look, it's pretty easy you could look at a sort of 1823 sleeve and it will be different to an 1826 sleeve. You know, fashion in the 19th century, because of industrialization practices and because of technologies that were really, you know, roller printing, the dyeing techniques, the sewing machine, things were changing at a really quite a pace. So definitely that has been an ever-present factor, I think, particularly from the 19th century onwards, that industrialization really speeds up the pace of change, and that's the root of it, I think. Really, in the 18th century you see people remodeling silks quite often, reusing fabrics, and it starts to gather pace from the beginning of the 19th century.
I would imagine so, as well, as you said, with, you know, factories becoming more popular, for example. Lorna, just a quick comment from Lorna. I have to read this out because it's lovely. This has to be one of the most interesting online talks I've ever had the pleasure of enjoying. Thanks, Lorna.
Lovely. Thanks, Lorna.
Question from Leslie in Arizona. When did people start using patterns to make their clothes?
Well, interestingly, the US has an amazing collection. That there's a lady called Joy Emery wrote a book about the paper pattern industry. So if you want to check that out, it's a really interesting history of paper pattern use. The 1850s onwards, in the UK, you get the English Woman's Domestic magazine that starts to create patterns and include them in the magazine so that you could take the pattern out and actually use it. In the US, you start to get companies like Butterick's and McCall's, who become hugely popular, producing relatively cheap patterns in the late 19th and then into the early 20th century. So yeah, it's really, the sewing machine is what does it. I mean, people are using cutting patterns before that, but that's what really makes it popular from then on.
Game changer, the sewing machine. I've got a question from Sue. Who would the designers have been in the 1850s and 60s?
In Paris, one of the first well-known designers is somebody called Charles Frederick Worth. He was a British man. Yeah, he was really major sort of player. He was born in Lincolnshire, really interested in women's clothes and designing them, and which, you know, that's not normally. You have women make women's clothes, men make men's clothes. So he travelled to Paris and started up a company called Worth and Bober. He had a French partner, and it's the first time that you get the designer who tells women what they're going to wear, rather than women coming to dressmakers and saying, I'd like a dress like this. It's a completely different concept. It's the first time that you have someone saying, okay, I'm the designer, I'm going to tell you now what's fashionable, and women will wear my clothes. And that's what happens. So he's often called the father of haute couture, and the House of Worth continued right through until the 1950s. It was a really big. So yeah, that you have in the 1850s Worth. You start to get companies like Pacan, Doucet, Redfern in the UK, Lucille. So there are some from that period onwards. That's the point you start to get those big name designers who are influencing things.
It's amazing that that's where that concept comes from, of not going to a tailor and saying, make me this, but a designer then going, no, I'm going to design these fashions now.
And his wife paraded around the parks in Paris, and people would go, oh, I like what she's wearing. Where's that from? And it was really revolutionized the way fashion worked.
I mean, how often do we do that nowadays as well, when we see, you know, meet up with a friend or a family member and we notice they're wearing something that we like and we go, oh, where's that from? That's usually the first question we have.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't know about you, Kate, or anybody else at home, but immediately if I'm wearing a skirt or a dress and somebody says that they like it and it's got pockets, the first thing I tell them is, it's got pockets.
Yes. That's brilliant. I mean, there's a whole book on pockets and about the influence of you know, when women's wear has and hasn't had pockets. It's a really fascinating sort of evolution.
Yeah, just I've got so many comments to scroll through. I really hope we get to as many of these as possible. Sorry, I'm just scrolling now. Lynn asking, why are US and UK sizes different?
Oh, now that's a good question, and I don't know why that developed in the way that it did. I think the US was the first to do it standardized sizing, but why they're different to the UK method, I don't know. That's a very good question. I'd like to find out.
Brilliant. Right, I think I'm up to date. Everybody saying that they're enjoying this, Kate.
Oh, good.
Brilliant. Right, what I really want to talk about, because if we want to finish at 5 o'clock, we might go a little bit over. But if we want to finish at 5, I need to ask you this question. So what projects are you currently working on? Is there anything exciting that you might be able to share with us?
There is, and actually it links very closely with family history, because when I did my Alexandra research, that was very much about a kind of royal history that was already available. You know, family, if you're doing family history with royal families, it's easy. It's all there in the history books. So I'm actually undertaking a project which is my first venturing into a kind of family history, if you like. So I was given this amazing book about 3 years ago by a lady, a friend of mine, elderly friend of mine, and it is essentially it's a dress diary. So she didn't have any history about it. She had been given it. It was bought on a flea market in Camden in London in the 1960s, and she just held on to it, no clue about who it was. And it's basically a book that's filled with fragments of cloth. There are about 2,000 pieces of fabric altogether, and each one has got a little caption written above it. And it dates from the 1830s through to the 1870s. And basically, I've spent the last couple of years finding out who kept that book. And I have found out who kept it. It was a lady called Anne Sykes, who lived in Lancashire in the 1830s, was born there in 1817. And it's the most amazing thing. So it travels with her to Singapore when she goes to Singapore to live with her husband, who was a merchant. And the book is full of fragments that belonged to her, but also to her friends and family. So there's over 100 different names in it. And I'm gradually piecing it together. So I'm finding out who these women are. I'm using Findmypast to help me locate records, actually build out the lives of the people that I'm finding in this book. And it's just amazing.
That's wonderful. I mean, are there any, I mean, you might not be able to give too much away as you're still working on this, but are there is there anything that stood out for you so far that you've found?
There's some brilliant things. So, for example, there's a piece that just said, it's a piece of red flannel and it looks quite ordinary, but it actually says, part of the pirate's flag captured by the Admiral in Borneo. And I thought, oh, this is intriguing. So I Googled Admiral in Borneo, 1845, and I found out that it was Admiral Cochrane, who was on anti-piracy duties in that part of the world then, and he was chasing and tracking down and capturing pirate ships. So I've got a piece of pirate flag in there, but I've also got I've just found, so the lady I'm researching at the moment is somebody called Sarah Newman, and there are some of her dresses recorded in the book. I found her in the census records, and when I started tracking a little bit back through her family history, she's actually the great aunt of Beatrix Potter. So there's so many, I know, there's so many revelations in this book and so many networks of people, and it's about how important dress was to them. She's keeping all of these snippets because clothes were actually central absolutely to their lives and their experiences of it, and she's captured it in this volume, and it's just amazing. So I'm writing a book about it, which I have to submit to the publisher in April. So yes, I'm all about the book at the the
Do you happen to have this diary to hand? I don't know if
you I do. Would you like to see it? I've got it.
I'd love to see it. Everybody at home will be really excited to see this.
No, I've got it because I thought people might like to see it, and it's very, sorry to be out of view for a moment, but
no, not at all.
So is this this, you can see how fat it is. So it started off life sort of that thick, and then as she added more and more pieces, and I'm very lucky, I don't normally handle it, so you know, I'm usually very careful with it. Well, I am being careful with it, but so this is what the pages look like. And I'll see if you can see above each, let me find a piece where you can see the writing. So above each, it's written in very, very fine handwriting. Above each piece are little bits of handwriting. I think you can just about make it out there, where she's just written a name. It might be a name or date, sometimes a place, although not very often. She might say things like part of the velvet from Mr. Sykes's slippers in 1845. So you get, sometimes you get little hints about what it is, but yes, it's an absolute treasure.
That is a proper piece of history.
Yes,
I absolutely love it. And I love that that's led you into family history a little bit as well.
Yeah, amazing. And I'm just kind of, you know, so many, it's a bit like, I know you had Deborah Sugryan a few weeks ago talking about house history, and it's very similar in that this is a sort of window that then opens up into taking you into all sorts of different stories. So I'm finding out about Singapore and life in Singapore in the 1840s. I'm finding out about things like the cotton industry of Lancashire, because Anne's father was a mill owner in Tyldesley in Lancashire. So there's so many, it's when micro history just kind of blows up into big stories, and it's great.
I think you know, myself and that, but I think a lot of people watching will agree with this, is that one minute you've got a name in a book, and a couple of days later you've drawn up a little family tree for them, you've found out their occupation, excuse me, you can, and suddenly you've got this story, you've got this bigger picture of a person. And I think fashion history and clothing is one part of that, and you can just build a bigger picture of what this person looked like and the life that they lived, the experiences that they had.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. Right, let's have another quick look at the comments here. I think Niall messaged me one, because I think I might have missed it. Oh, I think he's been sending me them. Let's have a look. Let's just make sure I've not missed any. Oh, here we go. Victoria asks, what is the oldest garment you have investigated, and what would you say is the most stunning piece?
Ooh, one of the earliest that I've ever personally sort of been around is probably a Tudor glove that we had in our collections. That was pretty amazing, and lace as well, sort of 17th century lace, which is, when you think about it all being made by hand, that always blows my mind as well. You know, that everything is hand stitched, hand fashioned at that point. So I think that's the oldest. And a pair of 18th century stays as well, corsets. We had a particularly old one of those in the collection. And I think one of the most stunning, one was Queen Alexandra's coronation gown, which is in the Royal Collection, and which I was able to see a few years ago now. That's all gold. And was just, it was a gold underdress with a gold net overdress, gold embroidery, gold, you know, it was stunning.
Wow.
So that was quite a statement piece, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I feel a little bit underdressed now, just listening to that description, and I suddenly feel like I need to go and look up a picture of that, because I've not actually seen it.
Yeah, I do look it up. It's really, it's everything in the kitchen sink, that dress.
Another couple of comments. Jen saying pockets, even my 11-year-old comments on clothes with pockets. I don't know what it is, it's just there's some sort of fascination about it. What else have we got here? Yeah, Tess saying, what will the final format be? Will it be a book or a film? And so it's going
to be a commercial non-fiction book. So my Queen Alexandra book fell into the realms of academic, you know, it was an academic publication with an academic press, which means it's, you know, they're more expensive, they're not published in such great numbers. So this is actually being published by Chatto and Windus, which is part of the Penguin Group, and it's going to be a, you know, affordable non-fiction, sort of normal size, I think normal size paperback, that kind, or, you know, standard sized book. So it's meant to be affordable and readable, and about stories.
Yeah, I can't wait to read it, actually. I think I will be one of the first people to buy it.
Thanks.
Tess also saying the book better have lots of photos.
Well, hopefully. Well, and the good thing is, you know, pictures are difficult in book. My Alexandra book didn't have as many pictures as I would have liked, because, you know, picture libraries and things, they're expensive. But I own this book, so there's no problem with copyright, which is great.
Winning. Oh, it's our friend Deborah. She says, Deborah Sugg Ryan. She says, so wonderful to see this, Kate. Really looking forward to the book coming out.
Oh, hi Deborah. It's lovely to
Thanks
know
for
you
watching, Deborah. Yeah, just lots of people commenting on the diary, saying it's just a little gem, which is brilliant. We'll finish up in the next couple of minutes, but I just want to try and make sure we get through as many questions as possible. Rebecca's asking about maternity clothes. When did they come into being?
Well, maternity clothes is really interesting. There have been some recent publications. I can't off the top of my head remember the actual titles, because they're an earlier period. They're sort of 17th, 18th century. Maternity wear is one of those things that, of course, no one talked about, because you just sort of were gracefully pregnant and you didn't talk about it in polite society. So a lot of things in the 19th century, it's about adapting things that you already own. So you might get your dressmaker to let skirts out. You might have, you still wore corsets, but they would be laced in a different way, and they would be let out as the pregnancy progressed. So it's more about adapting things that you already own, rather than there being actual maternity garments. That's very much a 20th century, you know, sort of mid 20th century onwards notion. But I'm sure that there were companies that were doing it, but it's quite under researched. I'm sure there was Edwardian maternity wear, but it's a fairly under researched area, and I'm sure there'll be scholars working on it. But yeah, it's not something that you see in, you know, in the press, and it's because it was very much a hidden history, really.
That could be your next book.
Yeah, I mean, it's oh, there's so much.
There's always something else where you think, oh, I could go and research that now. Okay, so I think that's all of the questions. I'll just read a couple more of the comments that we've had coming in. So Sue says, I've got a photo of my grandmother as a child with a pocket pinned to her dress. What have I started with this pocket discussion?
Yes,
So
there's a whole other talk on pockets.
Gary's saying good luck with the book.
Thank you.
Lorna saying this book of swatches is beyond exciting, and thank you for sharing. And she said she was also excited about the pirate story as well.
Oh, I know. There are so many different aspects of it. It's a real treat.
Fantastic. A comment from Enid here. One of the most interesting dress displays I visited, can't remember where now, included clothes for people in wheelchairs. Do you know when this began?
Oh, that's a really good point. I don't know when that began. I do know that, for example, at Ryerson University in Toronto, they have a number of scholars who are working on fashion and diversity there, and it's including designers who are designing for people who are sitting a lot, so whether that's wheelchair users or other kinds of physical difficulties. I think, interestingly, there's more and more research and development going into that now than ever before. You know, things like clothes for children with children who are on the autistic spectrum, for example, and clothes that have got soft fastenings and easy access for all sorts of different users. So I think look, if people are interested in that, look up Ryerson University diversity and fashion. There's lots of interesting research going into that. But the history of it, again, that's a really interesting idea, and I don't know when that actual actually started as a distinct kind of area.
That could be another book.
Yeah.
Right, I think we'll finish up there. We have gone to 5:10, so we've overrun a little bit, but I just wanted to get through as many questions as possible. It has been an absolute pleasure having you on as a guest today, Kate. Everybody in the comments has been really interested, and thank you everybody at home for tuning in and sending in your questions and interacting with us. It's one of the reasons we carry on doing these sessions, so thank you so much for that.
Oh,
Kate, have you enjoyed yourself?
It's been lovely, and thank you everybody for joining in and asking questions and just being there. It's really lovely to connect, so thanks for having me.
I think that's so important now, especially that we can connect this way. And yes, okay, we might not be able to go out to things like trade shows and archives, but we can still connect like this.
Exactly.
So make sure everybody at home, if you're on Twitter or Instagram, go and follow Kate, especially her Instagram account. It is beautifully curated, definitely worth a follow there. We've got people saying thank you from Elaine, my mother. You're still watching, Mum? That's amazing. I knew she'd be interested in this one. From Ivy, from Victoria, from Jackie, from Cindy, from Lorna, from Clarice, Fenella, Rebecca, Sue, Linda, Ellen, Linda. Fantastic, lovely. I really hope you've enjoyed it. Now on Friday, Alex is back doing Facebook Live at 4 o'clock, so you can tune in then. I remember you can watch all of these back on YouTube and on our Facebook page. So for now, I think we'll say goodbye, and I hope you all have a lovely, lovely rest of the week. Thank you, Kate, as well.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.